Hey everyone, I'm Imran. I'm one of the founding partners at Blossom Capital. We're an early stage VC firm, 270 million under management, investing across Europe. About half our portfolio companies are tech infrastructure or developer first. So naturally, we spend a lot of time with open source founders, both of companies and of projects which haven't yet become companies. And I think one of the most frequent questions we get from creators of open source projects is, how should I think about commercializing the project? And it's not only about picking the business model that will commercialize most effectively, but it's also about picking a model that will work effectively with the open source product. I'm very fortunate that I started my career as a software engineer and actually been an open source contributor and a user since I was a teenager. And I've seen many companies go through the commercialization process, both as a user and a contributor, but also as an investor at my time at Blossom and previously at Index Ventures. And I think it's really worth thinking about those things, about ensuring that you're picking a commercial model that gives you a strong foundation for your commercial business. It's really key that your model allows the open source project and the community around it to flourish, because that's really going to be the top of funnel for your commercial business. It's really hard to make the commercial business succeed if the open source part isn't growing as effectively as the commercial part. So that aside, I'm going to talk a bit more about the commercial sides of open source business models now. And I think over the last few decades, there are a few models which have really proved themselves at scale. And by scale, I really mean models that can enable businesses to become hundreds of millions of revenue in scale, become public standalone companies. And historically, the first model that really achieved that was actually the services and support model. So this was a model that was really pioneered by the likes of Red Hat and MySQL, and more recently Hortonworks. But it's actually a model that's fallen out of popularity in recent years. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is, but I think it's a great case study for picking how you should think about picking a business model. It's interesting, even if you go back and ask the founders of these billion-dollar companies about their choice of business model, many of them, if they go back in time, have said they would actually consider a different business model. And I think there's a few reasons. I think when you're evaluating an open source business model, you should be looking at three key things. One, is it scalable? Or how easy is it scalable? How easy is it to go from 1 million revenue to 10 million revenue to 100 million revenue? Two, how defensible is it? When you built a great successful company, is it easy for competitors to come in and essentially offer the exact same thing as you do? And three, margin. And this is really important because there's a huge variation in profit margins between these different kinds of business models. And the higher the margin you have, it means the more money you have to deploy into things like the open source project, adding more engineers to add core functionality. It could be how much money you can put into marketing and promotion. And it really affects how much money you can put into growing the business, which really affects how fast you can really grow. It also has a very direct implication on valuations. And I'll talk a bit more about that as I go on. And unfortunately, the services model doesn't really do well on any of these three criteria. In terms of scalability, you really have to scale by headcount, but essentially what you're providing as a services and support is engineering capacity. So to win more customers, you have to hire more engineers, and as everyone knows, that's super hard to do, even in the best of times. So it really creates a bottleneck in terms of scalability. And worse still, it's really hard to defend. When you're a small company and your customers are buying the engineering time of the core team that built a product, your customers will feel really excited by that and they'll be thrilled to pay a premium. But as you scale and you add the 100th engineer or the 500th engineer or the 1,000th engineer who isn't any longer working on the core product, but rather is a full-time consultant and is focused on providing services, then it's really hard to differentiate against your competitors. And this is really what we've seen in practice. So for example, if you look at Red Hat, at the high end, IBM came in to offer their support and services for Red Hat Linux. At the small end, you had a lot of local consultancies offering similar services. And suddenly, Red Hat found themselves in a very competitive environment for providing consulting and support for a product they essentially built. And then margin. Partly, again, this is driven by the other two factors around defensibility and scalability, but margins for services are generally quite low. So typically you're talking about 20 to 40%, which is much lower than typical 80% you see in most tech companies. So what's really replaced this model? Well, two models have basically emerged to replace the services model: hosting and open core. So hosting is essentially what it says in the box. You take your open source project and you provide it as a hosted service. And this makes a lot of sense in infrastructure startups or infrastructure projects or things like databases, where your end customer doesn't really want the overhead of doing DevOps, ensuring high availability, and just a practical hassle of having to maintain another service, and are happy to pay a premium for that service. However, there's probably a limit to how much they're willing to pay for that service. If you offer it to them at a huge markup, it's unlikely you're going to get very many customers, because your customers always have the choice of doing the same thing in-house. And in practice, this means that open source companies that offer a hosted service typically operate at 40 to 70% margin, which is much better than the services model, but it's still not quite at the product level of most tech companies. In terms of scalability, it's much better than the services model, because rather than scaling by headcount, you're scaling by infrastructure. And because of modern cloud infrastructure providers, infrastructure is much easier to scale than headcount. Now, defensibility with this model is actually an interesting one, because it's something where the market has changed quite a bit over the last few years. Historically, if you were offering a hosted version of an open source project, you were the only person offering that. But in recent years, you've got more and more third parties coming in and offering hosted versions of open source projects they didn't build. Most notably, Amazon, who obviously have a much lower cost of providing infrastructure than essentially anyone else in the market. So they can often undercut the company that built the product. And so companies have responded to this in one of two ways. One is by changing licenses to prevent third parties using that open source project. So, for example, Redis or MongoDB have changed the license to prevent third parties offering hosted services based upon their projects. Secondly, some of the companies have adopted a hybrid of the hosting and the open core approach. So they offer a hosted version of their product, but with additional functionality. So differentiate themselves from the players like Amazon by showing that if you get the host service from them, you also get some added functionality bundled in. And you get this with companies like Confluent or Elastic. I think we're still a bit early in terms of understanding how this competitive dynamic plays out in this market, but I think it's definitely something that's worth thinking about if you're considering the hosting model. And now moving on to open core. So open core is by far the most popular open source model among the large successful open source unicorns. And I think there's a few reasons for this. If you look back at the criteria of scalability, defensibility, and margin, in terms of scalability, it's the most scalable model. If you're not familiar with the open core model, it's really about having the open source project as the core and then building a commercial project on top of that that really extends the functionality of the open source core. And because you're essentially a product company, it's much more scalable. You essentially have to build a product, and then whether you sell that product to 10 customers or 20 customers, it doesn't affect your underlying costs. So it's far more scalable than the other two approaches. Second, on defensibility, it's as defensible as any other SaaS or non-open source infrastructure company, because you're offering essentially a proprietary offering on top of the open source core. And then in terms of margin, again, you're very similar to comparables in the tech market, because you can get 80% margin because your customers are willing to pay that extra premium because you're offering them a unique product they can't get in any other way. However, that's not to say the open core model doesn't come without challenges. The biggest challenge is deciding what goes in the commercial product and what goes in the open source product. As I mentioned at the start, it's really important to think about trade-offs when you pick a model. And this is the model where you have to think really hard about that. Because if you throttle the open source project to enable the commercial project to do well, you might end up harming yourself in the long term. As I said before, the open source project is your core foundation. If that doesn't succeed, it's really hard for your company to succeed. And so if you restrict core functionality from your open source product, it's really hard for you to succeed. But on the other hand, If you put all of your functionality in the open source core, then it's really hard for your commercial side to succeed, because who's going to buy the product if all the functionality they need is in the open core? Luckily, over the last few years, you've seen a few design patterns emerge for how you should be thinking about these things, which really indicate common kind of functionality that open core companies have found they could add, while striking a good balance between the open source and the commercial project. I think they fall into three broad categories. One, design and usability features. So these are often things like collaboration features, better user experience, better user interfaces, which aren't really around the core functionality of the product, but really about making it easier to use. Two, enterprise features. So these are things like security features, like audit trails, or enterprise integration into other enterprise software. And thirdly, verticalization solutions. This is where you take a core product and you add additional features that are only valuable to a very small segment, but who are willing to pay for that. For example, a good example of this is Elastic. If you're a security team using Elastic, you want specific additional security features that will help you in your job as a security team. And so Elastic have a great security product. But the majority of Elastic users who are, for example, if you're using Elastic for search on an e-commerce website, you're not going to care about the security features. Those aren't a part of the core product that you care about. So if you look at these three kind of common patterns, the big commonalities between the two are, one, these are features that enterprise companies are really willing to pay for. If you look at essentially almost any enterprise B2B, or if you look at almost any B2B tech company, the vast majority of the revenue is driven by those enterprise customers. So you really want to be thinking, what are the features that the enterprise customers want? And two, these are all features which are unlikely to be contributed by a third party and are unlikely to be on the roadmap for the open source project because they're not considered core. I think the last thing you want to happen is for you to build something into your commercial product and then have a contribution to the open source project which competes against it. Then you're forced into the position of either you accept that into the open source product and you harm your commercial product, or you reject it and you harm your reputation in the community and potentially result in a fork in the open source project. So you really want to think carefully about this. But I think if you really think about what are the things that are unlikely to be contributed, and all of those three categories I mentioned before fall into that, you rarely see like features, things like UI, UX enhancements or collaboration tools contributed from the open source community. You rarely see things like audit logs or other security features added by the open source community. And you rarely see verticalization solutions added by the open source community. So I think it's a great way of thinking about how you make the decisions about what goes into commercial product and what goes into open source product. So if you think about these three models, which model should you pick for your open source project? I think it really depends on your project. I think if you've got like a use case where open core makes sense, if you've got like a lot of examples of similar products, for example, if you're a database where you can see other people have done this well, that's obviously the route I'd recommend looking at first. But if you've got like a more unusual project, for example, if you've got like a front-end open source project, or you've got a project which is much more of a platform, then it's really worth thinking about what are the alternative business models that might work for you. And you're really using the three criteria of scalability, defensibility, and margin to think about how you evaluate different models. I think a great example of thinking outside the box is actually Android. Google could have decided that they wanted to monetize Android by licensing it to manufacturers and focusing on revenue that way. But actually, they decided to turn it into a marketplace by building Google Play on top of Android and essentially taking a cut of every transaction on the Android platform. And that actually works spectacularly well for them. Android is now probably the most successful open source project in the world by revenue. And so it's really worth thinking what's right for your project. And obviously, I'm around today. If you want to have a one-on-one chat, feel free to reach out. I'm also available on Twitter or email. Always happy to speak to open source project founders. So do reach out. But otherwise, hopefully this has provided some useful insight in how you should be thinking about open source business models. Thank you for attending.